One of the advantages of the digital age is it gives us an almost unprecedented ability to see how incredibly stupid the human race can be. There are literally millions of videos online that begin with or could begin with the famous words, "Hold my beer." In fact, people do deliberately, ridiculously dangerous things and pull insanely ill-conceived pranks just to get those all-important clicks and become internet famous. But if you think that is a brand new trend, no, it isn't. In fact, one of the most ambitious stunts pulled just to get attention occurred all the way back in 1896. And as is often the case, things didn't go exactly as planned. It seemed the right thing to do at the time, crash at Crush in 1896, deserves to be remembered. The original idea for one of the world's first Hold My Beer events did not come from Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad agent William Crush. A 2014 edition of the Lancaster, Ohio Eagle Gazette actually attributes the idea to one A.L. Streeter, who in 1895 came up with the idea of staging a collision of trains for entertainment and profit. According to the Eagle Gazette, Streeter originally wanted to stage his train wreck in Illinois, but to the state's credit, he couldn't get a railroad to back him. But Ohio was not as discerning. Streeter planned his staged railway crash in Canton, Ohio, charging tickets to the grounds where the crash would occur. The Greenville, Pennsylvania Shenango Valley News reported that two locomotives of the Cleveland, Canton, and Southern Railroad, weighing 40 tons each, are to be smashed at Canton, Ohio, under the direction of A.L. Streeter. They will be started 1 mile apart and allowed to collide when going 60 miles an hour. Streeter, whom the Pittsburgh Daily Post described as a fellow whose bump of originality must be of unusually large proportions, planned for the crash itself to occur in an enclosed area, admission to which he would charge, as well as to earn money via selling tickets to an excursion train taking people to the event. But the enterprising Mr. Streeter's bump of originality apparently exceeded his pocketbook. The Eagle Gazette explains that the event had to be canceled at the last minute and was a financial failure. The Gallion, Ohio Inquirer wrote on July 24th, "The great railway collision advertised to occur on Saturday near Canton under the auspices of A.L. Streeter was a grand failure. The engines didn't collide, the simple reason being that Mr. Streeter didn't own any engines. It is true that there were two locomotives on the ground, but they were the property of the CC&S Railway, and that corporation didn't care to have them smash up simply for the fun of the thing." The paper noted that Mr. Streeter could have secured the engines by paying $2,400, but didn't have that amount of change inside his vest pocket. Not only did Streeter apparently fail to secure permission to use the locomotives, but it turns out that his plan had another flaw, as the grounds were only partially enclosed and many people simply skipped paying admission, and the woods were well patronized. Of the crowd of some 8,000 in the vicinity, the Inquirer notes only about 190 had purchased tickets, which then had to be refunded. While his first try was a bust, Mr. Streeter would have another opportunity the following year, staging a collision for the Columbus and Hocking Valley Railroad in Buckeye Park in Fairfield County. The Lancaster Daily Eagle reported, realizing that a very small percentage of the people at large have ever witnessed a railway collision, and believing that such an exhibition would prove most interesting and attractive to the masses, the management of the CHV&T Company have completed arrangements with Mr. A.L. Streeter for such a demonstration as the opening attraction of their famous pleasure resort, Buckeye Park. There was no admission for the event this time, just the expected profit from tickets sold on the excursion trains taking people to the park, although the Hocking Sentinel reported that many in the crowd of some 30,000 had come to the park by conveyance other than trains of the Hocking Valley Railroad, and therefore had the fun without expense to themselves. This time, Mr. Streeter managed a much more successful collision. The engines were started, and then the engineers jumped from the trains. The Austin, Texas American Statesman reported that the immense crowd was silent with awe as the engines steamed into sight. There was a terrible crash and the roar of escaping steam. The Sentinel wrote that many brave spirits breathed hard, a number of women screamed, and several men fainted. What more could be desired? The Eagle Gazette notes that it was believed that Buckeye Park's collision was the first successful one in the country. But the paper laments, unfortunately, if you Google staged train crashes, the one held in Crush, Texas on September 15, 1896, 3 months later, receives more coverage. As they say, everything is bigger in Texas. Smithsonian Magazine wrote in 2017, for the 2 million settlers of 1890s Texas, entertainment was hard to come by. Opportunities for mass enjoyment were few and far between, which gave railway agent William Crush an idea, smashing 2 trains together purely for public spectacle. It's not quite clear if William Crush was directly inspired by the July event in Ohio, although it seems very likely. The Online Museum of Unnatural History writes that no one will ever know what inspired the idea in William G. Crush's mind. By all accounts, he was a conservative man and a solid citizen not given to crazy ideas. Brett Derbies of the Texas State Historical Association told the Smithsonian, maybe part of the crash at Crush is for people to actually see a wreck. Maybe this is a tourism thing. Maybe it's a legacy thing. It certainly kept William George Crush's name alive for more than just his job. While some argue that the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railway, which was commonly called Katy for its initials MKT, was looking for ways to get publicity in the wake of the economic depression of 1893 when many railroads had gone bankrupt, Derby's questions that reasoning, as railroads more generally were in Texas to stay. One possible reason, the Museum of Unnatural History writes, is that Katy simply had extra locomotives, as it had been switching out its 30-ton engines with newer 60-ton engines. There is some disagreement over the enthusiasm by the Katy directors for the event. HistoryNet writes, the Katy's corporate nabobs were skeptical. It sounded absurd, dangerous, and worst of all, costly. But in any case, they note, Crush's persuasive powers had the railroad brass in the roundhouse. The railway profits would come from ticket sales, which offered tickets from anywhere in Texas for $2, or $3.50 round trip. Crush was a natural salesman. The Austin American Statesman reported General Passenger and Ticket Agent W.G. Crush of the Katy has come home and has nothing on his mind now save a grand scientific show he is preparing for men of all political parties. He doesn't know about anything else. He doesn't think about anything else. He can't talk about anything else and won't. Oh, but it's going to be a smash-up, though, he said. When a reporter asked if he feared that the governor might call a special session to prevent the act, Crush replied, No, we expect to invite him to see it all. In the interests of science, you know. Crush's plan took a step beyond that of Streeter, as Smithsonian explains. Crush cooked up an even bigger, the ultimate crowd pleaser. A gladiatorial battle. 2 35-ton locomotives would ran into each other in Crush, a pop-up town erected for the occasion and named after the architect himself. Instead of staging the spectacle in an existing city, Crush chose a spot along the Katy route between Dallas and Houston. HistoryNet writes that Crush reassured readers the place selected for the collision is a natural amphitheater, and nobody will have any trouble viewing the entire exhibition. He would only divulge that the site was between Hillsboro and Waco, a span of 30 miles. We will announce the exact place later on, he teased. To handle the crowd, the Online Texas Almanac writes, 2 water wells were drilled at the site, and the railroad hauled in 5 tank cars of water and several tons of ice for the crowd. The water was piped to the top of a hill on the property, and several hundred faucets were placed at convenient intervals. 2 telegraph stations were built. The Handbook of Texas Online writes that in early September, 500 workmen laid 4 miles of track for the collision run and constructed a grandstand for honored guests, 3 speaker stands, 2 telegraph offices, a stand for reporters, and a bandstand. A restaurant was set up in a borrowed Ringling Brothers circus tent, and a huge carnival midway with dozens of medicine shows, game booths, and lemonade and soft drink stands was built. Finally, workmen erected a special depot with a platform 2,100 feet long, and a sign was painted to inform passengers that they had arrived at Crush, Texas. Smithsonian writes that Crush hired a man from Dallas to run a dozen lemonade stands, brought in tanks of artesian mineral water, erected a restaurant, and even a wooden jail that would be patrolled by 200 hired constables. But the main attraction, apart from the trains themselves, was the row of carnival attractions, based on Chicago's highly popular Midway Pleasance at the 1893 World's Fair. This feature alone will be worth going to Crush City to see, construction foreman A.D. Arbogast told the Galveston Daily News. This is going to be the event in Texas this year. Other Texas papers seem to agree. Crush's dream caught the gay 90s fancy, wrote Kenneth Forey in the Dallas News. It spread until people talked of little else. Politics, the chief entertainment at Texas Crossroads, went into hibernation until the wreck was over. HistoryNet writes that even as workers set the stage for the big event, Crush was inundated with public interest. Mail come from each coast, all points in between, and every city, town, and village throughout the Lone Star State. The correspondence, as one account put it, piled up to his eyes, and the 3 stenographers Crush hired couldn't stem the tide. The Katy chose locomotives number 999 and number 1001, painting 999 green with red trim and 1001 red with green trim. Frank Barnes, a member of one of the locomotive crews, told a Katy Employee magazine 50 years after the event, "We had a good time before the wreck, though you see, in order to advertise the event, we toured all of North Texas with one of the trains. We went to Waco, Denison, and all those towns along the Katy. Thousands of people came to see the engines at each stop." And the publicity worked. The crowd in the previously non-existent town on September 15, 1896, was even larger than predicted. Smithsonian writes that the event turned out to be so popular that the collision had to be delayed, since trains were still arriving at the scheduled 4 p.m. showtime. Some 40,000 people came in total, briefly making Crush the second largest city in Texas. Texas Almanac writes that the news reported that a crowd that big had never before been seen in Texas, except for Tennessee Day at the State Fair several years before. The Galveston Daily News wrote, "Men, women, and children, lawyers, doctors, merchants, farmers, artisans, clerks, representing every class and every grade of society, were scattered around over the hillsides or clustered around the lunch stands, discussing with eager anticipation the exciting event that they had come so far to see." Stephen Sloan, director of the Baylor Institute for Oral History, told KWBU, "Well, there's a kind of surrealness with it when you first hear the story, to imagine this happened, to imagine that in this middle of nowhere, for a day, what would have even been the second largest city in Texas popped up to see this event that still seems hard to imagine that it actually occurred." Of course, a train wreck could be dangerous, but here Crush was also careful. Barnes recalled that Mr. Crush took every precaution to make the whole affair a safe event. You know, that was back in the Lincoln pin coupler days, and in order to keep the trains from breaking apart, they were fastened together with extra chains. As an extra safety precaution, the rails were pulled up behind each train. That was in case one of them got away, couldn't run wild down the main line. For safety, the Texas Almanac wrote that almost all the spectators were to be located on a hill at least 200 yards away, at a point from which they would have, according to the Dallas Morning News on September 14, 1896, a perfect view of the destruction. Only photographers and reporters were to be allowed within 100 yards of the track. But there was a concern. In a testament to liability law, the Dallas-based Rand Sankey law firm writes that there were concerns about the durability of the engine's boilers and whether they would hold up under the stress caused by the crash. Because of the design of a steam engine, if a boiler ruptured, it would cause an explosion very similar to that of a bomb. Of course, it seems obvious that if one or both of the engines were likely to explode, the engine might be too dangerous for spectators. However, Katy's engineers assured Crush that the boilers could withstand the pressure. But was this really a good idea? Because, after all, when you call something a train wreck, that's not usually a compliment. HistoryNet writes, the overwhelming response only buoyed the railroad agent. He'd promised his employers publicity, and they'd gotten plenty, and the best was yet to come. If, for the moment, Crush felt that he could do no wrong, he'd soon be reminded that pride does indeed goeth before the fall. HistoryNet continues. At 5 sharp, the dueling locomotives steamed slowly down the track and, like gladiators, stopped face to face in the middle of a salute. Then the engineers reversed gear, and the trains lumbered back up to their starting points. Telegraph symbols ran back and forth. "Are you ready?" "Yes." "Then go." Crush raised his hat. The crowd roared, and the train started downhill. A sound like the rattle of musketry added drama as each locomotive set off a series of track torpedoes, tiny charges used by railroads as warning signals that crews had fastened along the rails. Nearer and nearer as they approached the fatal meeting place, the papers reported. The rumbling increased, the roaring grew louder, and hundreds who had come miles to see found their hearts growing faint within them. The Austin American Statesman reported on the 17th. The greatly advertised and much talked of Katy collision came off here this afternoon at 5:33 o'clock and was carried out to the letter, as was always the case with affairs under the Katy management. In a nutshell, the collision was superb, awe-inspiring in the extreme, and grand in the sublimity. But the paper adds, it had a sad feature, however, in that several were wounded, and 1 or 2 deaths may be resultant. What the engineers had said would not happen, did. Smithsonian notes a news report from the time. A crash, sound of timbers rent and torn, and then a shower of splinters. There was just a swift instant of silence, and then, as if controlled by a single impulse, both boilers exploded simultaneously, and the air was filled with flying missiles of iron and steel, varying in size from a postage stamp to half a driving wheel, falling indiscriminately on the just and unjust, the rich and the poor, the great and the small. In the end, the event that was billed as the crash of the iron monsters turned out to be what today we might call a train wreck. 2 people were killed, dozens more injured. The official photographer that Crush had hired to photograph the event lost an eye. The book Texas Obscurities says that a Confederate veteran who was a witness to the event said that the smoke and explosions and people falling all around him was more frightening than Pickett's last charge at Gettysburg. Afraid of the publicity, Katie fired Crush immediately and sought to settle the lawsuits. But when it became clear that the publicity from the event was mostly positive, they rehired Crush, who worked for the railroad, until his retirement. As can happen with stunts today, even ones that seem to end in disaster, the publicity only helped Katie, which grew and is today part of the Union Pacific. And as can happen with stunts that go on today, it seemed to spark a trend, as Atlas Obscura notes that staged train wrecks remained popular entertainment at fairs and festivals into the 1930s. It is September 27th, and 158 years ago today, on September 27th, 1865, a circus clown by the name of James Cook walked a tightrope that had been strung between a restaurant called the Cliff House and a rock called Seal Rock over a portion of San Francisco Bay. According to the San Francisco Examiner, when he got to the other side, he was greeted with raucous applause. And the feat was all the more dangerous because, as the newspaper The Alta California noted, Mr. Cook didn't know how to swim. But his feat of funambulism, the technical term for tightrope walking, was not really all that impressive, because during the 19th century, the ancient activity achieved all sorts of new and sometimes ridiculous heights. It is history that deserves to be remembered. A March 16, 1866 edition of the Illustrated Sydney News profiled James Cook, noting that he was born in Dublin and at the age of 12 commenced training for the profession in which he was to the manner born. Mr. Cook was a circus clown, but apparently not the run-of-the-mill type. The news continues. For hackneyed as the business was, and is, Mr. Cook opened up an entirely new sphere and most successfully demonstrated that a clown is not necessarily a fool. Notably, Cook was, the news opined, one of the most talented gymnasts that ever visited the country, as well as a model clown. After a successful run in New York, Cook and his circus, the news writes, toured the principal cities in the north and thence to California. It was there that he performed his high-wire act above San Francisco Bay. Mr. Cook, demonstrating the foibles of funambulism, had had to delay his walk. Originally, he had intended to do the walk on the previous Sunday, but the San Francisco Examiner wrote, the wind was blowing keenly from the south, and to make the situation all the more disagreeable, rain began to fall. And to crown all, Cook failed to walk the rope. Everybody was mad, wet, dirty, and disappointed, and the swearing of the crowd rivaled that of the famous army in Flanders. The Sacramento Bee reported that Cook said, the wind was too high, but I will certainly do it next Wednesday, and in order to do so I have postponed my departure for Australia until after that day. The Bee added a bit of sting to its report. Today is Wednesday, and if the wind does not blow too hard, Cook will walk his rope. Of course, San Francisco will be depopulated, and there won't be a hack left in town to carry home a fat woman who might faint in the street, but that's none of Cook's business. The walk did indeed occur on Wednesday, but it didn't go without incident. The Contra Costa Gazette reported that at 12:15, Cook started out from the Cliff House on the rope, walked steadily forward until he arrived within 100 feet of the rock when one of the guys broke, nearly throwing him off his feet. Quick as a thought, he soon dropped his balance pole and reached the rock in safety. The trip back from the rock was without incident, the Gazette writes. After passing the center, coming up the home stretch, Cook hastened his step, and as he walked up was received by the multitude with great applause. But not everyone was impressed. The Bee buzzed, now this funambulism is getting to be a stale entertainment. It wasn't an idle complaint. Mr. Cook's feat came at a time when the ancient art of tightrope walking was reaching new heights. The website of Balencia Slacklines notes the age of the daredevil activity. Ancient plaster paintings buried for 1,700 years under the same volcanic ash that buried the ancient city of Pompeii. depict what look like small demons walking what are unmistakably tightropes stretched over A-frames, a structure slackliners still use today. The discovery stretches the written or painted record of tightrope walking as far back as AD 79. Historian Oriana Leckert explained in Atlas Obscura in 2014 that funambulism dates back at least to ancient Greece. That's where the name comes from. Funi means rope, and ambulare means to walk. The high wire was highbrow in late medieval and early modern Europe, with Leckert noting that an acrobat carrying candles walked along a rope suspended from the spires of the cathedral to the tallest house in the city at the coronation of Queen Isabeau in Paris in 1389. Funambulists also performed at the coronation of Edward VI of England in 1547, at the occasion of Philip of Spain's arrival in London to meet Queen Mary in 1554. But, Leckert notes, during the late 1600s in England, tightrope walkers began to be associated with a disreputable element, including pickpockets, streetwalkers, and conmen. But nothing put the fun in funambulism like the new 19th century fad. Leckert writes, in the 1800s, everybody wanted to walk across Niagara Falls. It was the unbelievable feats at the famous falls that led the Sacramento Bee to be nonplussed with Cook's walk across his wire, with the paper noted, Niagara's had her foaming cataracts banned with elastic cords. The feats of fancy above the foaming cataract began 6 years before Cook's balancing act above the bay. American Heritage writes that on Thursday, June 30th, 1859, the atmosphere at Niagara Falls was charged with excitement. A slightly built Frenchman, dressed in tights and carrying a long balancing pole, was planning to attempt the impossible. He was going to walk across the terrible gorge of the Niagara River at about a mile below the falls on a slender rope cable, 190 feet above the swift and boiling flood. As they watched in fascination, shading their eyes with their parasols, ladies in crinolines nearly swooned. Strong men in top hats and stocks were tense, for many had wagered large sums on the outcome. Little girls clung to the skirts of their nurses, and small boys skylarked. 300,000 people, or was it 10,000, held their breath as Jean-Francois Gravelet, better known as Blondine, edged out onto the sloping cable. A Frenchman born in 1824, American Heritage writes that physically Blondine was a small man, distinguished by the blue eyes and the blonde hair that had given him his nickname. He stood only 5'5" and weighed a mere 140 pounds. Nimble and wiry, he had developed superb coordination on the tight wire during years of experience in theaters and circuses. He possessed imagination and courage and tremendous self-assurance, even enough courage and assurance to perform without a single slip the fantastic acts that were the fruit of his imagination. He began experimenting on the tightrope when he was 5 years old. But it was over Niagara that he would gain his fame. American Heritage continues. There were restaurants and drinking places and Punch and Judy shows and two-headed calves and bearded ladies. It was a place made to order for Blondine. Sadly, given the level of daring-do, the crowd was disappointing the first time he crossed, something the Buffalo Courier explained. It was owing to the general cry of humbug which caused so slim an attendance, although the Courier notes that the thing was fairly and bravely done. No one who saw it can for a moment doubt. But, the Courier noted, we learned that Monsieur Blondine will give another performance of a similar kind on the 4th of July, when the probability is that there will be a largely increased attendance. And there was. But the performance on the 4th was not just similar, but far more. American Heritage writes, the river scene, when that holiday arrived, must have been a strange one. Every vantage point, every tree, every rock, as well as every seat in the grandstands, was occupied by a huge crowd, morbidly confident that Blondine would lose his balance and plunge into the Niagara Gorge. They never took their eyes off him lest they missed the awful moment. Betting on the outcome was said to have been huge. At the appointed hour, Blondine appeared at the American end of the cable with his 38-foot balancing pole. Halfway across, he lay down full length on the cable, putting one foot above the other. He walked backward swiftly, balanced on one foot, extended the other and also his body over the boiling flood. He whirled himself around as if he'd been on a pivot stool, and repeated this in the center of the cable, took a flask from his pocket and drank, and then completed his journey. And that was just the start. On the 15th, he crossed the wire walking backwards and then pushing a wheelbarrow. On August 3rd, he crossed while performing a number of tricks, including standing on his head and a backward somersault. And on August 17th, he set a new standard, crossing the 1,200-foot cable while carrying his manager, Harry Colcord, on his back. The act nearly went wrong when, as with Cook, one of the guide wires broke, but wireman and manager managed a safe recovery. And his tricks went on. American Heritage continues. Once he crossed with baskets on his feet and shackles on his body. And another time he carried a table and chair and tried to seat himself on the chair with two of its legs balanced on the cable. And the chair fell into the Niagara and Blondine nearly tumbled after. He regained his balance, sat down on the cable, and ate a piece of cake. washed down with champagne. In another trick, Smithsonian Magazine writes, he carried a stove and utensils on his back, walked to the center of the cable, started a fire, and cooked an omelet. When it was ready, he lowered the breakfast to the passengers on the deck of the Maid of the Mist. Blondine became known as the hero of Niagara, and it's easy to see how the bee was less than impressed with Mr. Cook merely crossing a wire. Blondine's fame, however, inspired numerous imitators, creative people in their own right. One of those, a New York native named William Leonard Hunt, who performed under the name The Great Farini, duplicated many of Blondine's stunts, including crossing the falls while carrying a man on his back that the Buffalo Courier described as a Canadian from Bowmansville, McMillan by name, a head taller than the acrobat. But Farini did Blondine one better, if not in skill, at least in sheer oddity. Leckert writes that his coup de grace in 1860 was crossing the falls with a washing machine strapped to his back. In the middle, he stopped to wash several handkerchiefs, which he then gave to his waiting admirers. The Courier quipped, Farini and Blondine should be canonized by the inhabitants of the falls. Periodically, they make these solitary places populous, and are a perfect godsend to the hack drivers and vendors of lemonade. Crossing Niagara was not Hunt's only feat, however, as the great Farini would later become the first known white man to cross the Kalahari Desert on foot and survive. Proving that a woman can tiptoe as well as a man, in 1876, Maria Spelterini, an Italian acrobat who'd been performing in circus acts since the age of 3, became the first woman to cross the falls on a high wire, earning the sobriquet the heroine of Niagara. Like Blondine and the great Farini, she repeated her feat many times, and with more creative challenges, including, Leckert writes, once with her wrists and ankles manacled, once with a paper bag over her head, and once with peach baskets on her feet. And while her fearlessness was ferocious, it might have been the most impressive for a female funambulist, as the Brooklyn Daily Eagle described an extraordinary event in 1869. An exciting scene occurred the other day at Alcazar in Spain. Mademoiselle Rose Saki, a rope dancer, was performing some jugglery feats, balancing daggers, lighting torches, etc., on the tightrope, when suddenly the cry, "You're on fire!" arose from the audience. A piece of burning stuff from one of the lighted torches had fallen on her head and set her long hair on fire. With one foot on the iron rope and another in the air, the woman did not lose her presence of mind. She passed her hand over her clothes and felt nothing. "In your hair!" cried the excited people. Mademoiselle Saki understood, and carrying her hand to her head, rapidly stifled the fire. She then continued her performance, as if nothing happened. To be sure, the activity had its dangers. In 1887, a local tightrope walker named Stephen Peer, who had crossed Niagara many times, fell to his death attempting to cross at night. In a time of social media, when people will do virtually anything in order to get attention, we might think of ourselves as the ultimate hold-my-beer generation. But like so many things, the achievements of the past really put our present to shame. To be sure, there were daredevils before the 19th century, and there have been plenty since. In fact, the last person to cross Niagara Falls on a tightrope was famous funambulist Nick Walinda in 2012. And in 1974, French funambulist Philippe Petit became world famous when he, without permission, strung a wire between and tightrope walked across New York's more than 1,300-foot tall twin towers of the World Trade Center. But there was a unique draw in a time when people were doing things so dangerous that the spectators were literally wagering on whether they'd survive. Smithsonian Magazine notes that by the time that Blondine gave his last performance in 1896, he had crossed Niagara Falls on a tightrope more than 300 times, and overall had walked on his tightrope more than 10,000 miles. Douglas Corrigan was an aviation pioneer in a time of aviation pioneers. He didn't have wealthy backers like contemporaries like Charles Lindbergh or Amelia Earhart. He couldn't command the attention that Howard Hughes could. But when Douglas Corrigan flew into history on July 17, 1938, by completing the first non-stop transatlantic solo flight from Brooklyn, New York to Dublin, Ireland, he had a unique claim to fame because he was supposed to land in California. Way Corrigan deserves to be remembered. Corrigan was born on January 22, 1907, in Galveston, Texas. His birth name was Clyde Corrigan, but he legally changed his name as an adult to Douglas. His family moved around during his childhood and ended up in Los Angeles, California. Corrigan dropped out of high school, worked in construction for a while. Reflecting on this time in life, Corrigan would later say, I never had any aims. That's why I never got anywhere. But the directionless existence ended when at age 18 he took a $2.50 ride in a Curtiss JN4D Jenny on a sightseeing tour. After that, Corrigan saw his future in the skies. He began taking lessons every Sunday at an airfield owned by B.F. Mahoney and Claude Ryan. His first solo flight took place on March 25th, 1926. Mahoney and Ryan hired Corrigan to work at Ryan Aeronautical Company in San Diego, and he was with the group that constructed the Spirit of St. Louis, the custom-built, single-engine, single-seat high-wing monoplane that was flown by Charles Lindbergh. Corrigan was responsible for installing the wing, an instrument panel, and gas tanks for the famous plane. Along with a colleague, he increased the plane's lift by creating a wing 10 feet longer than any previous Ryan aircraft. Corrigan met Lindbergh in 1927 and wasn't impressed. He said, "Gosh, he looks like a farmer. Do you suppose he can fly?" Corrigan and his co-workers celebrated when Lindbergh made history in the plane that they constructed. That event would cement in his mind that he wanted to do the same thing, complete a solo crossing of the Atlantic, except his destination would be Dublin instead of Paris, in order to celebrate his Irish-American heritage. When Ryan Aeronautical moved from San Diego to St. Louis, Corrigan decided to remain behind in California, where he became a mechanic for a flight school. He loved to go up and practice dangerous stunts over and over again, so much so that the owners of the school asked him to stop. They were afraid that he was being a bad role model for the students and that he would crash their airplane. Instead of acquiescing, he simply flew his stunts farther away from the airfield so that they wouldn't see him. In 1933, Corrigan purchased a Curtiss Robin for $310 and set about customizing it in order to make his dream of a transatlantic trip come true. He added additional gas tanks and a new engine, a Wright J65 with 165 horsepower. But a federal inspector, after examining Corrigan's plane, determined it was not safe for an intercontinental flight, though he was approved to fly across the United States. He continued to apply for permission to make his dream flight, and federal authorities continued to deny his application. In the meantime, Corrigan added even more gas tanks to his Curtiss Robin and dubbed the little plane Sunshine, because I'd always considered my plane as a little ray of sunshine. After Amelia Earhart's plane disappeared in 1937, Corrigan feared he would never receive permission to make his flight, as the government began demanding even more safety measures for pilots. They told Corrigan he must get a license to operate a radio, though Sunshine didn't even have a radio for him to use. When authorities refused to issue a flying license for his plane, Sunshine was grounded for 6 months. Corrigan made a few final adjustments to the plane, approximately $900 worth, or what would be around $16,000 today, and flight inspectors looked over the changes and gave him an experimental license. They also approved a flight plan for Corrigan to travel from Los Angeles to New York and back again in 1938. It was then that Corrigan seemed to take matters into his own hands. On the first part of the flight, from Long Beach to New York, one of the gas tanks in Corrigan's plane sprung a leak and gasoline sloshed around his feet. Some historians say he completed his first leg of the trip with his head hanging out the window in order to not become sick from the fumes. By the time he landed at Roosevelt Field, Corrigan estimated there were only 4 gallons of fuel left in his tanks. He examined his tanks and decided to risk the flight, as repairs would have taken him at least another week to complete. Corrigan made the short flight from Roosevelt Field to Floyd Bennett Field, where everyone had their attention on the famous Howard Hughes, who was preparing to take his infamous flight around the world, and very few paid attention to what Corrigan did next. On July 17th, Corrigan filled his tanks with 320 gallons of gasoline. He brought a compass, a map of the United States, 2 chocolate bars, a quart of water, and 2 boxes of fig bars. When he began his flight, Sunshine was so heavy that she traveled more than 3,000 feet down the runway before her wheels left the ground. 31-year-old Corrigan took off and disappeared into the fog, except that he was headed east as opposed to west, which his flight plan clearly indicated that he should. He had to crouch in the airplane because it was so crammed with fuel cells, and on the way, Sunshine sprung the gas leak again. This time, all he did was use a screwdriver to punch a hole in the floor so at least it wouldn't slosh around his feet but drain out while he was flying. To compensate, he increased his speed a little bit. Corrigan later said he saw a fishing boat and realized that he was going to live through the crossing and open some of his meager rations to celebrate. Then he said, "I noticed some nice green hills." He landed Sunshine on July 18th at the Baldonnel Airport in Ireland. Corrigan hopped out of his plane and said to the surprised Irish airport workers, "Just in from New York. Where am I? I intended to fly to California." When he checked his gas tanks, he had 30 gallons left. In an interview with United Press, Corrigan said, "I don't feel very tired, but I sure was surprised when I found myself off the coast of Ireland." When a customs official and Army officer met the pilot, he had an explanation ready. "I got mixed up in the clouds and I must have flown the wrong way." When he couldn't produce a passport, Irish officials called the American embassy. Though the customs agent at first considered arresting Corrigan, he ended up letting the pilot go, saying that this type of incident, a flight arriving with no entry papers, had never happened before and he wasn't sure what the proper protocol was. The American official from the embassy, John Clarence Cudahy, asked Corrigan to explain how he came to be so far off course. Corrigan replied that he must have misread his compass. The official replied, "It was hazy when you took off, was it? Well, your story seemed a little hazy too. Now come on and tell me the real story." To which Corrigan reportedly said, "That's my story, but I sure am ashamed of that navigation." While in Ireland, Corrigan met the Prime Minister of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, who was more amused than angry by the stunt. De Valera said he thought since Corrigan was able to come into the country without papers, he should be able to go home without them too, and he thanked the pilot for bringing the world's attention to Ireland. Corrigan made a side trip to England and met the American ambassador there as well, Joseph Kennedy. U.S. aviation officials required more than 600 words to list all the regulations Corrigan broke in a telegram. In response to his unauthorized flight, American authorities suspended Corrigan's license for 2 weeks. But it didn't matter because Sunshine wasn't flying back home. Officials booked Corrigan and his plane a ticket on the steamship Manhattan. He passed his 2-week suspension on the ship. Corrigan received a hero's welcome when the ship pulled into New York. Mayor LaGuardia congratulated him on his successful flight. The public was enchanted with Corrigan. Not only had he defied authorities to fulfill his dreams, but he invented a story to explain it and never backed down when confronted about its truth. His brazen flight was a welcome respite from the economic depression and the drums of war already beating in international reports. In his obituary, the New York Times explained the reason for his fame. He was an impish young pilot who had boldly thumbed his nose at authority and then baldly denied it. Also, anyone looking at the plane Corrigan used to make his flight marveled that he had made it so far in one piece. The American journalist H.R. Knickerbocker wrote of Corrigan's plane Sunshine, "His plane, a 9-year-old Curtiss Robin, was the most wretched-looking jalopy. As I looked at it, I really marveled that anyone should have been rash enough to even go in the air with it, much less try to fly the Atlantic. He built it, or rather rebuilt it, practically as a boy would build a scooter out of a soapbox and a pair of old roller skates." Corrigan defended Sunshine in later interviews, saying, "She's good enough to fly around the world. All the motor needs is a bit of grease." The newspaper, the Daily News, reported that Corrigan had pulled one of the grandest wild stunts of all time, and they labeled him a swell egg and an Irish adventurer of the old school. New York City had an estimated 1 million people turn out for Corrigan's ticker tape parade, even more than had showed up for Lindbergh's celebration. He banked on his celebrity to pen an autobiography entitled "That's My Story," and sold items that went the wrong way, like backward spinning watches. Hollywood came calling the next year, and Corrigan played himself in a biographical film about his transatlantic flight called The Flying Irishman. He was paid $75,000 for his role in the film, which was the equivalent of 30 years' salary as an airplane mechanic. When the U.S. entered World War II, Corrigan served his country as a test pilot and flew for the Air Transport Command. After the war, he participated in parades with other war heroes. He married and raised 3 sons, one of whom died tragically in a plane crash. Though his wife would die in 1966, Corrigan lived until 1995 in the ripe old age of 88. He maintained until his death that he accidentally flew to Ireland rather than California. Towards the end of his life, in 1988, John Corrigan was invited by organizers to a commemoration of the 50th anniversary of his now famous flight. Corrigan had become a semi-recluse after the death of his son, but he was tempted back into the public eye and even produced Sunshine, which he had disassembled and stored in a barn all those years. With just a little bit of effort, they were able to get her engine running again. People there said his eyes lit up so much when the engine started that the organizers felt it was necessary to put a guard on either side of the plane to make sure that there were no more accidental flights. Whether it was truly accidental or simply defying authorities, John Corrigan became one of the first few aviators to make a solo nonstop flight across the Atlantic Ocean, and he did so just because he loved to fly. And shouldn't we all be that lucky to discover our life's dream and to go make it happen and just not take no for an answer? I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.